Ryan stood in the middle of the sprawling living room, the kind you see in those glossy magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with expensive art. He was only 8 years old, but there was a fire in his eyes that made him look older, stronger than his years. Clutched tightly in his small hands was a simple red box, wrapped neatly but with no hint of the storm it carried inside. "Grandma," Ryan said, his voice steady but carrying a weight no child should ever have to bear. "Dad told me to give you this if you ever made me feel like I don't belong again." The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered awkwardly between bites, and even the background music seemed to hold its breath. Everyone's eyes locked on Ryan, on the tiny boy who had just dropped a bombshell in the middle of what was supposed to be a festive family gathering. Margaret, the matriarch of the family and the undisputed queen of this opulent Chicago estate, forced a tight smile. Her fingers trembled as she took the box, curiosity flickering briefly before suspicion and confusion clouded her face. She peeled back the wrapping paper, the sound loud enough to echo in the tense silence. Inside was a framed photo of Mark holding Ryan the day he legally became his son, the caption underneath reading, "Day One Dad." Beneath the photo lay a sealed envelope, thick with significance. Margaret's smile faded as her eyes scanned the adoption papers inside. Official, legal, undeniable. She blinked, like willing the documents to disappear, but they remained there, cold and unyielding. Then came the letter, written in Mark's own handwriting. She unfolded it with shaky hands, and the room hung on every word. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've hurt my son again. Not just because you can't see him as family, but because you refuse to accept what's real. Ryan is my son. He's your grandson. And if you can't love him equally, then you don't love me." The words landed like a hammer. Margaret's face drained of color, her composure cracking for the first time all evening. The grand dame of the family, the woman who had been so generous to every other grandchild, was suddenly reduced to something raw, vulnerable, exposed. Then came the scream, a sharp, guttural sound that ripped through the quiet like a lightning strike. It was neither grief nor anger, but something deeper, a shattering of the facade she had maintained for decades. Gasps rippled through the room. Chairs scraped against the hardwood floor as family members shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to look or what to say. Margaret's sister reached out to steady the table, but Margaret had already backed away, muttering, "I can't believe you'd embarrass me like this." Mark stood slowly, voice calm but resolute. "We didn't embarrass you," he said quietly. "You did that all by yourself." The tension was suffocating, yet amidst the chaos, Ryan sat quietly, eyes fixed on the floor, but a quiet strength radiating from him. He wasn't scared or confused. He was witnessing the truth unfold in a way only a child forced to fight for belonging could understand. And as the family grappled with this moment that would change everything, one question hung in the air. How did a boy, who was supposed to be loved the same as the others, become the one who carried the weight of the family's darkest secret? The answer was coming, slowly, painfully, and it would shake the very foundation of everything they thought they knew. From the moment I first met Margaret, I thought she was the kind of grandmother every child dreams of. A powerful woman with a commanding presence, but with a soft spot for her family. She had this way of making you feel important, even if just for a moment. But beneath that polished exterior, something was quietly shifting, and it didn't take long before the cracks began to show. Mark had 2 kids. His son Ryan, 8 years old, was from my previous marriage, and then there was Jake, his biological son from his first marriage. At first, Margaret seemed to welcome Ryan with open arms. Cards on birthdays, small gifts during the holidays, things any grandmother would do. But as time passed, the difference became glaring. It wasn't just subtle anymore. It was an invisible line drawn in the sand. Ryan wasn't invited to the weekend soccer games with the cousins. He wasn't included in the family photos that hung in the hallways like trophies of perfect family moments. At Christmas, while the other grandchildren unwrapped brand new laptops and $500 gift cards, Ryan's gift was a cheap pack of colored pencils. I remember watching him at the breakfast table, his eyes fixed on the pile of glossy gadgets and envelopes beside his cousins, and there was this quiet, sinking feeling that no child should ever feel, that he wasn't truly part of the family. Mark and I tried to keep the peace. We told ourselves it was just Margaret's way, maybe a generational thing, that she was just used to her own bloodline and needed time. But as the seasons passed, the silent exclusion became a loud, unspoken truth. I saw Mark clench his jaw when he thought I wasn't looking. The tension growing in our late-night talks where he'd say, "I notice it too. I just don't know how to fix it without breaking everything." And Ryan, he became quieter. Not the lively, smiling boy who used to run around the house, but a shadow of himself, retreating further into the background with each passing family gathering. I caught him once, staring longingly at a box of new gaming gear one of his cousins had received. He turned to me and whispered, "Mom, does Grandma even know I'm her grandson?" Those words crushed me. It wasn't just about gifts. It was about belonging, about being seen and loved for who he was. But Margaret's affection was reserved for Jake and the other grandchildren who shared her bloodline. Her approval. Ryan, despite all the legal papers, the adoption, was treated like an outsider in the very family he was supposed to be part of. The conversations between Mark and me grew harder. We argued, not in loud fights, but in the quiet, exhausted voices of two parents trying to shield their child from a world that was already so unkind. "Should we confront her?" I'd ask. "Is it worth the fallout?" He'd nod, promise to say something eventually, but eventually never seemed to come. One afternoon, after another birthday party where Ryan sat silently on the couch while everyone else played, he looked at me with those big, hurt eyes and said, "Maybe Grandma thinks I'm just visiting." It was the first time his pain was spoken aloud, and I realized how deep the wound ran. We had stayed silent for too long, hoping things would change, hoping that love alone would bridge the gap. But the truth was, love without recognition was invisible. And Ryan? He was invisible. That growing divide between Margaret and Ryan wasn't just tearing at our family. It was breaking my son's spirit. And the question that haunted me was simple but terrifying. How long would we pretend this wasn't happening before someone finally said enough? Because beneath the smiles and the holiday cheer, a storm was building, and no one could ignore it forever. It was Christmas Eve at Margaret's sprawling Chicago estate, the kind of place where the holidays felt more like a gala than a family gathering. The house sparkled with twinkling lights, the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and the grand dining room was set with china so fine it almost seemed too precious to use. But beneath all the glitter and cheer, a tension simmered, one that only a few could see. The other grandchildren gathered eagerly around the massive tree, their hands already itching to tear into the lavish gifts waiting for them. iPad Pros, thick envelopes stuffed with cash, VIP tickets to the Bears game. Each present screamed privilege, the kind only Margaret knew how to bestow. Everyone's eyes sparkled with excitement, except one boy. Ryan stood quietly by the fireplace, clutching a small box wrapped in plain paper, its contents far from the flashy treasures being handed out. When Margaret called his name, a cold smile barely touched her lips as she handed Ryan the box. "We didn't want you to feel left out," she said, almost as an afterthought. Ryan lifted the lid to reveal a single lavender-scented candle, small, simple, almost dismissive. The words hit the room like a slap. A gift so plain, so lacking in thought or warmth, it shattered something in the heart of that 8-year-old boy. I saw the flicker of confusion, then hurt, wash over his face. His cousins squealed with delight over their gifts, but Ryan just sat down, candle in hand, as if it were a consolation prize for a race he wasn't allowed to win. Mark, his father, clenched his jaw, his usual calm cracking just enough for me to catch it. Yet, he said nothing. He didn't want to start a fight. Not tonight, not at a party where so many eyes were watching. But the weight of that moment pressed heavily on both of us, and I could feel the anger brewing beneath his surface. Later that night, when the house had emptied and the festive noise faded to a dull hum, Mark and I finally talked. His voice was low, strained. "I know what she did wasn't right, but confronting her could tear the family apart. I shook my head, the exhaustion in my bones weighing me down. But what about Ryan? What about his heart? I whispered, tears threatening to spill. Maybe Grandma doesn't really love him. Maybe she never did. Mark's silence was louder than any argument. We had been tiptoeing around the truth for too long, pretending the cracks weren't widening, but that candle was a glaring spotlight on everything we'd been avoiding. Ryan, my sweet boy, started asking questions no child should have to ask. One afternoon, as I helped him with his homework, he looked up with wide eyes and said softly, "Mom, do you think Grandma even knows I'm her grandson? Or does she just pretend I'm here?" It broke me. The innocence in his voice mixed with a deep sadness no 8-year-old should carry. That night, as I lay awake, I thought about what family really meant. It wasn't about gifts or grand gestures. It was about being seen, being chosen. Ryan wasn't just a child missing out on toys. He was a boy fighting to find his place in a world that kept telling him he didn't belong. And as the snow fell outside our window, I realized we were standing at a crossroads. We could keep pretending, keep swallowing the pain for the sake of appearances, or we could face the truth head on, because sometimes the smallest gift reveals the biggest betrayal. And the question wasn't if Margaret loved Ryan, but how far we were willing to go to make sure he knew he was loved, truly, fiercely, without conditions. What happened next would change everything. Mark never wanted it to come to this. But after years of watching his son, Ryan, being sidelined by his own grandmother, he knew silence was no longer an option. One evening, as the house grew quiet, he pulled me aside and revealed something I hadn't expected. A small, simple red box, heavy with meaning. Inside that box were documents that Mark had kept hidden away for months. The official adoption papers, proving he was Ryan's legal father, a framed photo from the day Ryan officially became part of our family, and most importantly, a letter addressed to his mother, Margaret. The letter was raw, honest, and unforgiving. Mark looked at me, his eyes clouded with years of conflicted emotion. "I wanted Ryan to have the power to say enough in the only way he could," he said quietly. "I didn't want it to be about fighting or drama. I wanted it to be undeniable." It was a burden he'd carried silently, the struggle between wanting to protect his mother and standing up for his son. Every time we tried to talk about it, Mark's voice would falter. "She's my mother," he'd say, "but Ryan is my son, and they deserve to be treated equally." I knew the weight of that struggle. I watched Mark pace the room late at night, wrestling with guilt and frustration, trying to find a way to bridge a gap that seemed to grow wider every day. But finally, he made his choice. Ryan, at 8 years old, was about to carry a responsibility far beyond his years. We sat together for hours, rehearsing the words he would say, the simple yet powerful phrase Mark had given permission to use. "Grandma, Dad told me to give you this if you ever made me feel like I don't belong." At first, Ryan hesitated. It was a heavy thing for a child to carry, the weight of standing up to a grandmother who should have been his fiercest ally. But with every practice, his voice grew stronger, more certain. I saw a new determination in his eyes, a quiet courage that belied his age. One night, as I brushed his hair before bed, Ryan looked up at me with a calm I hadn't seen before. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm ready." I wanted to tell him that he shouldn't have to be ready, that no child should ever have to fight for love in their own family. But instead, I held his hand and whispered, "You're so brave." That red box wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a symbol, a challenge. It was Ryan's way of saying he would no longer be invisible, no longer the forgotten grandson in a house full of fancy gifts and polite smiles. As we prepared for the confrontation that would change everything, a part of me trembled with fear, because this was more than a family dispute. It was a reckoning, and none of us knew exactly what would come next. But one thing was certain. Ryan was no longer willing to be overlooked, and Margaret was about to be forced to face the truth she had long avoided. The morning sun filtered softly through the windows of Margaret's dining room, but inside, the air was thick with tension. It was family brunch, a routine gathering that felt more like walking into a battlefield than a celebration. Ryan sat quietly beside me, the small red box resting heavy on his lap, his fingers wrapped around it like armor. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day everything would change. Margaret greeted everyone with her usual polished smile, unaware of the storm about to be unleashed. When she finally looked at Ryan, he stood up, steady and calm, carrying the weight of every hurt he'd ever felt. He walked straight to her, eyes locking onto hers with a courage that stunned the room. "Grandma," he said clearly, his voice carrying the strength of a man twice his age. "Dad told me to give you this if you ever made me feel like I don't belong again." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Margaret's fingers trembled as she took the box from Ryan's hands. With deliberate care, she peeled back the wrapping, exposing the photo of Mark holding Ryan on adoption day, the moment Ryan officially became family. Below it lay the legal documents, undeniable proof that Ryan was her grandson by law. And then the letter. Margaret's eyes darted to the handwritten words, scanning each line as color drained from her face. Gasps escaped from the family gathered around. Margaret's carefully maintained facade crumbled, replaced by shock and fury. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "How could you embarrass me like this?" The room's atmosphere shifted instantly, the warmth of a family brunch replaced by icy accusation. Some relatives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. A few quietly stepped forward, nodding in support of Ryan, but others looked away, unwilling to confront the reality laid bare before them. Mark rose slowly, his face resolute. "This isn't about embarrassment," he said firmly. "This is about truth. Ryan is my son, and he deserves to be treated like family. If you can't accept that, then maybe it's time to reconsider what family really means." His words cut through the tension like a knife. Margaret's glare shot towards me, accusing and full of blame. "This is your doing," she spat. "You turned my son against me." I met her eyes without flinching. "Ryan gave you a chance to see him for who he really is. You chose to turn away." The room felt like it was holding its breath, every heartbeat loud in the silence that followed. Ryan sat back down, his eyes calm but resolute, no longer the quiet boy who shrank away in the shadows. Today, he had claimed his place. The confrontation marked a fracture no one could ignore. It was the family's breaking point, where silence turned to voice and invisibility was replaced with undeniable presence. But the question lingering in everyone's mind was clear. What would happen next? Would Margaret change? Or was this the moment they lost her forever? It's strange how silence can feel so loud. After that brunch, we stopped going to Margaret's house. No more holiday parties with forced smiles. No more pretending the past didn't hurt. We found peace in smaller moments, baking cookies in our pajamas, building pillow forts, and making new traditions that didn't come with expectations or conditions. Ryan still wears the bracelet, a simple silver chain with a tiny heart, gifted by his cousin, a quiet gesture that said, without words, "You belong." That small act meant more to him than any expensive present ever could. It reminded us all that family isn't about bloodlines or fancy gifts. It's about who shows up when it matters, who sees you when the world tries to look past you. But here's the truth no one talks about. Some wounds don't heal overnight. The scars from being unseen, unheard, they linger, like shadows that don't quite fade. There are moments when I still catch Ryan staring out the window, wondering if he'll ever be enough for a family that once made him feel invisible. I haven't forgiven all the silence, the cold shoulders, the subtle cuts that felt like daggers. And maybe I never will. Not because I want to hold on to the pain, but because sometimes not forgiving is part of protecting the love you have left. If this story hits close to home, if you've ever felt like Ryan, left out, unseen, or less, then you're not alone. It's okay to stand up, to say, I deserve to be seen. I belong. Sometimes claiming your place means breaking the ties that bind you to pain. And that's one of the bravest things you can do. So if you felt that quiet ache of invisibility, if you know the weight of being overlooked in your own family, I hope you'll stay with us here. Share your story in the comments below. like if this touched you, and subscribe to Revenge Her Way, not because you have to, but because sometimes hearing others fight the same fight can be the first step to healing your own. Because this isn't just my story, it's ours. And together, we find strength in being seen.